Hello, everyone, and welcome to another iteration of the ESET East Africa webinar series. Today, we're going to be covering ransomware, and we're also going to be having a ransomware Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. So, in order to get started, or at least before I get started, as always, please feel free to send through your questions on the Q&A section, so that as we go along, if there's anything that you want to ask about towards the end of the webinar, we'll be answering all of those questions. And then, in addition to that, we'll also be adding this video, as per usual, to our wiki, along with some of the documentation that we're going to be talking about today. So you'll be able to find all of that information on our wiki for further reference. So in order to get started, obviously I'm not covering what ransomware is today, because obviously everyone would know that by now based on our previous webinar series. For those that might not know, essentially ransomware is, simply put, some form of malware that installs on your machine, usually through some type of email attachment that then encrypts the contents of your hard drive. And more typically, it also looks for specific types of files, such as your documents, your spreadsheets, your photos, and that type of thing. And then it encrypts that material and that data, and then asks you to pay some type of ransom, usually in the form of Bitcoin, which is obviously an anonymous cryptocurrency, which means that unfortunately those payments can't be traced back to the malicious party, which is why the malicious users have obviously chosen that as their method. So, obviously there's a number of issues with approaching the issue with ransomware. And for a long time, there's basically been an issue that you could only limit the spread of the infection and at least minimize the damage. More importantly, today we're going to be covering why a better approach is needed to combat the emerging threats that are available today. So first things first, unfortunately for those dealing with IT security, we obviously need to stay abreast of new and emerging threats to our digital security. And in the case of ransomware and malware in general, today's malware is dynamic and it's often targeted. So the multi-layered approach to IT security is obviously more relevant than ever. Secondly, current ransomware attacks, they keep finding new and improved methods, and they use advanced infection techniques that allow the malicious malware to infect your devices. Typically, they persuade individuals to execute what they call a dropper. This dropper is usually in some type of Office document or a PDF or some other type of file. And that in turn actually downloads the malicious malware payload to start the encryption process of your data. Next, most commonly, the dropper comprises of a JavaScript file. So the downside here is that JavaScript is obviously widely used by most websites, and it even gets executed directly by Windows. So generally, it's not feasible to block it entirely, and it's a huge burden to deal with the lack of functionality that you then have on websites and other applications. What makes it even more difficult problem to approach is that the JavaScript code in the dropper is usually heavily obfuscated. It also tends to be defaced, and it's continuously modified in order to prevent detection from antivirus and anti-malware software. Lastly, obviously, your users remain your weakest link. People are obviously prone to mistakes. They may open attachments and click on links that they shouldn't. So that's obviously why a better approach is needed in the ongoing combat against ransomware and other types of malware. So how can we stop it now? Luckily, ESET has created a set of additional settings that they've labeled the ESET anti-ransomware setup in order to try and prevent the execution of malicious malware. So the first of these is an advanced anti-spam rule set for the ESET Mail Security for Exchange. So with the right rules in place, obviously the incoming mail is filtered out of the mail server itself. So this generally prevents the attachment containing the malicious dropper from reaching the mailbox of the end user in the first place. And in doing so, it basically prevents it from executing, and it doesn't give it a chance to execute on the endpoint. The next set of settings are firewall rules for ESET endpoint security. These rules prevent the download of the malicious payload, and they also deny other scripts from accessing the internet. And then the last part of the ESET anti-ransomware setup are the HIPS rules for endpoint security and endpoint antivirus. So the host-based intrusion prevention system is basically able to interrupt unauthorized actions on a machine and from processes before they are executed. So by prohibiting the standard execution of JavaScript and some other scripts, ransomware cannot execute, not to mention download in the first place because of the previous rules. And then lastly, since users are still your weakest link, obviously adequate security awareness training is essential in the event of a malicious attachment ending up with the user. For more information on this last point, please contact us regarding our product KnowBefore. It is our simulated phishing and security awareness tool, or you can refer to our wiki. We have some previous webinars that are recorded. We also have data sheets and other information regarding that product. So these are obviously the methods that you can use to actually try and stop or prevent the infection in the first place. Beyond the scope of stopping the infection of ransomware, then there's obviously the reactive way of dealing with it in the form of an adequate backup and disaster recovery solution. And as I'm sure most of you would be aware by now, we offer a great product in that regard called StorageCraft. So StorageCraft would be your go-to for all types of needs regarding backup and disaster recovery. So that in the event that all of these following points actually fail, you will still be able to recover following an absolute disaster. So there are a few important considerations regarding the ESET anti-malware and anti-ransomware setup, because as much as we can do to stop the spread of the ransomware within an organization or network, some of the rules can have some undesired effects, and we're going to cover those in this slide. So firstly, the anti-spam rules may block legitimate attachments, such as Office files with macros. So in the event that you happen to use Office files with macros in your organization, this rule would need to be adjusted or disabled. And in terms of adjusting the rule, that could typically be by maybe whitelisting a specific domain or something like that, so that you can consider mail from the rest of your organization as trusted, as an example. Secondly, with regards to the firewall rules, it only applies to ESET endpoint security, because obviously endpoint security has the integrated firewall feature. And then third, the firewall rules can also block legitimate applications. So that's a rule that you should effectively test fully before implementing it as a policy. And then the fourth point is basically exactly the same, as the HIPS rule may also block legitimate executables. So in exactly the same sense as with firewall rules, you should effectively test these rules before implementing it as a global or organization-wide policy. So how would one implement these rules? Well, they are available as a download. It's a zip file that comes from the ESET website. We will be uploading the documentation to our wiki, as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar. So you'll be able to download that document. You'll be able to click on the link. You can go to the website and download the anti-ransomware settings. Next, it's basically a couple of steps to actually import it into your ESET Remote Administrator. The first thing you do is obviously log in to your ESET Remote Administrator version 6 web console. You'll navigate to the admin, then the policies section. Then you will choose policies, and after that import, and then there's basically the 3 policies that are included in the zip file, and you import these policies one at a time. And then after you've imported them, you basically adjust these policies and then apply them either to a group or a client. So obviously the idea here is that with the assistance from the experts over at ESET, you can basically greatly increase the security of your network in combating ransomware. Because as we've always indicated, unfortunately with ransomware, you can only do a handful of things in order to try and prevent it altogether, and these settings actually do that quite effectively. But you'll basically need to cater that with some specific settings for your organization in the event that you may happen to use some of those file types, like I mentioned, with the Office files with macros. So that wraps up the presentation section of this webinar. Obviously, the main purpose of today's topic is for any questions that you may have around ransomware and malware in general, and we can try and answer those as we go along. So I'll be waiting a couple of moments to see if anyone sends through any questions. I don't have anything just yet. We do only have a handful of attendees today, unfortunately, but obviously it means that I can maybe give you a much more personalized response. So please send through those questions, and then I can get around to answering those. While I wait a couple of moments for people to send through any questions, obviously while we're on the topic, I'm just going to be mentioning a few things around KnowBe4 and StorageCraft. Obviously in the case of KnowBe4, as I mentioned briefly during the presentation, essentially it allows you to run simulated phishing campaigns, right? So there's a couple of things that it can do. First and foremost, KnowBe4 as an organization, they're really effective at staying abreast of all of the emerging threats in the industry. So they constantly create new templates for simulating phishing and various ransomware attacks. And that can include things like dummy attachments that may mimic a malicious attachment or anything like that in order to try and trick the users to actually open them. What would happen if a user then opens that attachment is it actually calls back to the KnowBe4 servers. So you'll be able to see exactly which users opened that attachment, what time they did so, when they received the email, and so on. So you'll be able to then obviously provide them with the necessary training material in order to educate them about the threats around those types of files. So in a nutshell, effectively you can create all sorts of phishing campaigns that can mimic anything ranging from Facebook friend requests or LinkedIn invitations or a Office or Outlook web access invitation or password reset mail, in addition to simulating various types of ransomware attacks like I've mentioned. Those can then be sent through to groups of users or individual users. And then effectively what it does is if those users click on the link or if they open the mail, if they happen to click on a link and then go to a website and actually provide their credentials to a site that wasn't actually real, so it was a fake website, then all of that information is reported to you as the administrator. So you'll then be able to either manually or even automatically assign the users that clicked on links or opened attachments onto the relevant training courses. Those training courses are typically done through online material and videos, so they'll be able to go through the entire training course in their browser. And effectively, after that, they may need to complete a quick survey or questions, and basically in order to verify that they've actually picked up all of the information that they needed to pay attention to. And obviously the idea here is that you increase the security awareness overall for your entire organization, so that even in the event that all of these methods that we provide may fail, because obviously, as I mentioned, the malicious parties constantly change the way that they try and affect and infect users and their endpoints. So if any of these methods fail, you still have your users that are then hopefully no longer your weakest link and actually alert you to some type of dodgy email or something else that may have arrived in their inbox. Then on the topic of StorageCraft, with StorageCraft obviously, which we've covered many times, it's a complete volume-based backup and disaster recovery solution with a big focus on the actual recoverability. So everyone obviously should have some type of backup, but often what happens is these backups are not tested. So as part of the entire StorageCraft solution, there's a number of components that allow you to not only verify your backups, but actually test them on an ongoing basis. So you can do test restores for individual files or folders. You can also take entire backup images and actually start them up as virtual machines so that you can ensure that the entire set of data is intact and that those machines will in fact be able to recover. And that's in addition to various local and off-site replication mechanisms. So in the event that you need to keep a copy of your data somewhere off-site, be it doing it manually through rotating some type of hard drive, or if you want to transmit it over the internet, if it's a suitable measure for you, then all of those features are obviously available. I still don't seem to have any questions coming through yet, so I will give you guys a couple of moments further. As I mentioned, there are only a handful of attendees today, so maybe everything that I've said has been absolutely clear, so please send through those questions. Right, so I've got a question around how does the licensing or pricing work for KnowBe4, our security awareness tool. So essentially that's per seat per year. We've got a silver and a gold package available. The difference between the two is that the gold package includes a few add-ons, one of which is an email exposure check. And effectively what that does is when you sign up, KnowBe4 will actually go online and try and find all of your publicly listed email addresses. So maybe an info address or a sales address or a support address on your website in order to basically provide you with a report of any of the well-known or publicly visible addresses which may be targets for some type of phishing campaign or something similar. So it basically allows you to analyze where your potential weaknesses are in terms of your email addresses in order to obviously address those with improved spam filter settings or something along those lines. So that's one of the add-ons that's available as part of the gold package. The silver obviously includes the normal simulated phishing campaigns as well as the included training modules for anything ranging from ransomware to potential phishing campaigns or anything like that. Essentially, they're broken up into 50 user increments, starting at 25 seats. And essentially what you can do is you don't have to license your entire organization worth of users. So let's say it's an organization of 100 users. What you can do is maybe buy 25 or 50, because what you can then do is when you run a campaign, the campaign itself is limited by the number of seats that you have licensed, which means that you obviously don't have to run the campaign for the entire organization right off the bat. You can basically divide it up into smaller batches and approach it from that way. I don't yet have any other questions, so please send them through. Another question, it seems as though there might be someone who's not too familiar with the StorageCraft that we covered very briefly, also in terms of licensing. So in a nutshell, I'm not going to go into all the little bits of information, but from an overview level, essentially StorageCraft is well, it differentiates between physical and virtual, and between server and workstation. So typically a physical machine is more expensive than a virtual machine, and a server is a little bit more expensive than a workstation. And then it's basically the Shadow Protect component, which is the backup agent, which you basically license per system that you wish to back up. And then if you want to utilize any of the advanced features such as Head Start Restore, which allows you to pre-stage the backup images to make it readily available following a disaster. That's basically an add-on that you pay for per system that you want that feature for. That Head Start Restore also allows you to actually restore to dissimilar hardware. So it also allows you to perform migrations. So you can go from physical to virtual, or virtual to physical, and so on. So one of the main purposes of that tool is often organizations might have a long turnaround time for new requisition of hardware in the event that something fails. So they'll be able to take a machine, restore it to virtual infrastructure in order to obviously get a business critical application back up and running. And then once that physical machine has been replaced and it's been configured essentially, then you can start the recovery process from your virtual backups that have now been created from the running virtual machine right back to the physical machine. So there's a complete backup process regardless of what the destination might be. And as I mentioned, that Head Start Restore comes at an additional fee. Generally, it's only used for systems that are considered critical, such as mail servers or Active Directory servers, possibly web servers or something similar. There is also, while we're on the topic, an advanced feature in the case of StorageCraft called Granular Recovery for Exchange. It's a really nice add-on, and it doesn't even require the use of StorageCraft, but it obviously makes it a lot simpler. Essentially, you just need a backup of your Exchange database, and what will happen is, in the event that a mail gets deleted, or if something happens to your Exchange server, then you can basically recover individual emails or chains of conversation for a specific mailbox, as opposed to having to restore your entire Exchange server from scratch. So that's a bit of a digression, obviously, on the topic of StorageCraft. I'm hoping someone might have a question on the topic of ransomware. I've got a question here around how to deal with an actual infection. Obviously, it really depends on the type of ransomware that has affected that particular machine. Essentially, there's a couple of flavors or versions of ransomware malware that there are decryption tools that have been made available by a variety of security companies, such as ESET and a couple of others. And essentially what that does is for those types of ransomware that don't use extremely advanced techniques, or if they've maybe found some type of weakness in the encryption that is used in that ransomware, then you'll be able to recover your data. But unfortunately, that is a very small selection from the different types of ransomware that is available. So if you or one of your customers have been affected by an iteration of ransomware, then it would be a case of trying to identify which ransomware variant has actually affected that system, trying to determine if there is a known path to recover that data. If not, hopefully there is an adequate backup and disaster recovery system in place so that you can restore that system in question. And obviously it's a good suggestion to follow a restore up with a complete scan of your network to ensure that there aren't any other types of malware or other infections that might be in your network which could lead to future infections going forward. I've got another question for someone asking if you can get ransomware on your phone. Indeed, there are a couple of variants of ransomware that are available for Android. However, most of them happen to be some type of screen locker as opposed to an actual form of ransomware. And the reason for that is because, at least in the newer versions of Android, Google have released a number of updates for their security policies that basically prevent any app running on a phone to actually encrypt any type of data that that app was not responsible for creating in the first place. So that's why some apps can't interact with other areas of your storage in some cases. And that's effectively why the traditional way of ransomware, where your data is encrypted and you need to pay ransom in order to get that data back, that's a very, very seldom case in terms of mobile ransomware. What usually happens is, as I mentioned, it's some type of screen locker or blocker, which basically prevents you from using your phone in a normal way, because a screen comes up over everything else, over your lock screen, over any of the other apps that you might have running, and basically prevents you from using your phone in the first place. And the only way that you'd be able to bypass that normally is either paying the ransom, or if it's a suitable method, actually just doing a factory reset of that phone. So I've got another question on why most antivirus can't pick up various forms of ransomware. In a nutshell there, essentially a lot of the ransomware techniques that are used actually mimic the typical operations that you would have in your operating system, because unfortunately encryption is obviously a normal task. A lot of people use encryption in a legitimate way. So what often happens is the encryption process itself, once that actually executes on the machine, isn't detected as a malicious activity. And that's obviously why it really depends on the various forms of ransomware that have been identified, and that's why you'll find that some of the older versions of ransomware can be detected and possibly prevented because there's some known signature that they've been able to identify and subsequently stop. But obviously, with the constant changing of the ransomware infection techniques that malicious people use, it's obviously very difficult to stay abreast of those patterns, which is basically why ESET has provided the anti-ransomware settings in order for you to try and stop those files and other things from reaching your network in the first place. And in terms of some of the firewall settings, obviously, as we mentioned, it blocks the execution of scripts and those scripts connecting to the internet. And essentially, you can then try and block the activity that's going to known command and control servers, which are essentially the sources of the encryption key that's used as part of a ransomware infection. So you're basically trying to stop that communication from happening in the first place, as opposed to detecting malicious activity in an application that's running on your endpoint. So I haven't been getting a lot of in-depth questions, but obviously while we're on the topic, this is a Q&A session after all. So I would be interested to know of any of you that may have had some experience with ransomware either affecting yourselves or some of your clients. Maybe there's some pain points or some type of questions around the best practice on how you would potentially deal with something like this. If there's any comments or concerns or questions that you may have around those topics, obviously feel free to send them through. Okay, so it doesn't look as though there seems to be anyone of you that may have had an instance of ransomware at yourselves or one of your customers. So I think with that, we will be rounding up the session. Obviously, thanks for all of you who attended. As I mentioned, we will have the webinar as well as the mentioned documentation, as well as the details on how to download and provision the ESET anti-ransomware setup and settings on our wiki. If you haven't registered for that, please go and register. You will basically just need to provide your name, your email address, as well as your partner ID in order for us to verify you as a legitimate partner. And then you'll be able to access all of those resources online. Thank you very much, and have a good day.